Welcome back to Direct Station, where politics are in retrograde. I am Carey. If you've been wondering why, in this America, tanks are rolling through the streets of Washington, D.C., you've been wondering why armed masked men are harassing citizens, and the president threatens to expand this occupation to Baltimore, Chicago, and New York. If you've been wondering why you feel so afraid, why everyone around you is feeling so afraid, if you're wondering why they even conducted a pre-dawn raid on John Bolton's home, a former national security advisor, now enemy of the state. If you're wondering why a fitness guru is spouting off about how slavery was in this country and who was a good guy and who was a bad guy and why that's relevant now. Well, there's an explanation for all this, y'all. Of course there is. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about how one version of America is dying in the streets of Washington, D.C., but another version of America has been here all along, waiting, remembering what the land knows, remembering what the planets know about what's possible for this country. For those just tuning in, hi, thanks for coming. I'm so glad you decided to give it a try. Here's how it works. You will tolerate slightly more astrology than you might in your day-to-day, and I will provide a way to look at what we're living through. Today, we're going to talk about the rising tide of fear and control in America, the stunning, officially authoritarian takeover of our beloved democracy, but also about something much mightier and much older. I want to tell you about Chiron, a wounded healer in the sky who's teaching us how America's deepest, oldest wounds might become our medicine. It'll go like this. First, the news, briefly. I assume you're at least loosely aware what the hell is happening around you, but it feels important to put my own perspective on it. Next, we'll look at the astrological phenomenon that we've got going on that plays a role in all this and has played a role in similar moments throughout history. 3, the history of the situation for the humans and the planets. Next, some literary context from the seers and sayers who come before us. And finally, what we can do with it all, how we can make meaning of it all, how we can feel slightly better to begin to sort out what to do. Also, if this is your first time, don't try to hang on to the proper nouns. This isn't so much a class where you learn the names and meaning of planets, but rather a bit of a reflection on the themes worthy of reflection, depending on who's active up there. And believe me, it's active up there right now. So I'll mention some entities or some characters that you read about in middle school astronomy or Greek mythology, but the names are not nearly as important as the themes, as the concepts, as the feelings and behaviors of humans that are impacted by who's kind of playing around up there and the timing of all that. Does that make sense? Because while everyone's focused on the occupation, on the fear, on the escalating authoritarianism, something else is happening. The peoples who early white Americans tried to erase are now modeling recovery, reclamation, and healing. And there is a great deal we can learn by stopping and noticing and celebrating that. And the cosmic weather is offering unprecedented support for exactly that kind of transformation in our country and on our planet. And if we look back at the nourishing acts of resistance in oppressed communities historically in the United States, veterans, Black Americans, Native Americans, we see an astrological signature that gives us reason to hope. Yeah, horrible things are happening, and more horrible things will happen. This will escalate before it shifts for sure. We all know that in our bodies, right? But let's track the ways in which that escalation makes the transformation and the ultimate reset inevitable. Let's start with the week's news because the cruelty is reaching new levels of absurdity, as you know. Trump's Justice Department, and by Trump's, I mean a Justice Department unprecedented in its violation of an independent justice system free from politics, continued a shocking, unnecessarily surprising pre-dawn raid on John Bolton's home this week. John Bolton, the man who never meant a war he didn't want to start, who was Trump's own national security advisor in 1.0, who spent decades as the ultimate Republican hawk. Now he gets armed agents at dawn, neighbors watching in shock. There's a whole authoritarian theater. And for what? For writing a book? For comparing what we already know? For going on TV and saying things that are true about how this is going? For refusing to play along with that lie that everything is perfect and beautiful? I mean, I have a lot to say about this guy and his politics, but what I know for certain is that this is one of the most chilling shifts we've seen, as it proves to us our greatest fear. This is an administration that will eventually suppress all resistance or criticism if they are allowed to do so. They're starting with big fish that nobody likes to test the water. But this project certainly won't end there. In other news, the Trump administration and the right-wing media bubble this week also took on the work of museums and cultural institutions as if we already have a ministry of culture like China or Iran or Myanmar or North Korea or Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of talk that started, as much does, with a Trump social media post claiming that the Smithsonian, our national museum system, focuses too much on how, quote, bad slavery is. As they do, his minions followed up with much discourse about this, through which white people are diminishing the horrors of American history by decrying the, quote, racialized way we remember the country's beginnings. This theme that we've seen before now of how discourse about racial justice violates the rights of white people. We remember the long, scary saga of would CRT take over second grade or not, right? It's this conversation about white people wanting to sort of not learn about or not see or not talk about the past, American past, because of the shame or the guilt or the grief that it conjures or the way it reflects or demands reflection on how whiteness in America works, even now. So you got Jillian Michaels, the mean coach, the bad one from The Biggest Loser, who built her career on shaming people who are trying to change their lives. She's in the lead on this, explaining on CNN at a roundtable that you, quote, cannot tie imperialism and racism and slavery to just one race. Because apparently, in her opinion, there are less than 2% of Americans who owned slaves at any one time. She's gotten a bit of pushback and recently said this in a post, quote, no one excuses slavery. She's got a facepalm emoji. If you'd actually watched the clip, oh, I did, you'd understand the point. Oh, I do. There are more good guys than bad guys, she says. That's the takeaway. You can't pin all of humanity's evils on one race without sowing the very thing you claim to fight against. Demonization doesn't heal. It breeds resentment, and nothing good will come of that. Pay attention to what is happening in our society. The thrill of righteousness that comes through this tweet, because it has so many good lines, so many good phrases, so many clear seeming assertions. But the presumptions inside those assertions and the sort of only half the story part of this, right, is really where the game is. Because I assure you, madam, many, many, many of us are paying attention to what is happening in our society. But listen, this is good for us because it gets us so much clearer about what this is. Jillian does not want to feel what that 400-year-old wound is or was, nor is she interested in feeling the way that wound has festered in our modern society, nor is she interested in feeling the grief that comes when we contemplate the horrors of slavery and its descendants, systemic racism, and police brutality. These wounds are old and incredibly persistent, and Jillian is voicing what Trump's policies are trying to do. Erase the hard things. Sure, we'd all like to do that, but without processing them first, right? As a person who has built a career on theoretically helping people, she seems hauntingly unaware of the journey through darkness that so much healing depends on. But here's the thing, that this desperate need she has to not feel the wound, this desperate need that so many people have to not feel the wound, to skip straight to the moving on part, like a mother in denial of a child who's talking about having been abused, right? It'd be better if we could just move on. I don't want to have to feel all this, right? To coat everything in the sugar of there were more good guys than bad guys. It's exactly what prevents real healing. We've seen it in families, we've seen it in cities, we've seen it in nations, right? And in the same week, we're watching this denial play out on CNN. Something else is happening that shows us a completely different path. Because while some are trying to erase this wound, others are transforming it into medicine. But a story that is oddly related to the cruelty and the control rising in our country and the work necessary to heal from it is what has most of my attention this week, actually. This isn't a story in the headlines. It's located in this little restaurant that I visited this past week. And it just has my imagination and my respect and my kind of awe. It's this place called Owamni, Minneapolis, Minnesota. The story, which is written into the menu of this restaurant, which is built on the edge of this large plot of sacred Dakota land, upon which this man, Sean Sherman, who identifies as the sous chef, S-I-O-U-X, right? A play on the word sous, S-O-U-S. So the sous chef has opened this restaurant on the sacred land called Owamni, and he's named his restaurant Owamni. And the story of that place, which is written into his menu, begins with this, quote, "The indigenous perspective on the history of America is to acknowledge the centuries." Wait, let me say this a different way. I am going on about this restaurant and this location and this experience that I had last week because I think it is incredibly relevant. And I think I had it, frankly, because of something that was going on planetarily that I'm going to talk to you about. But I bring it to you because it is a sign and a symbol of hope. So I'm going to go off for a little bit about this restaurant, and I swear it will come full circle, but just come with me into this world, because here I am living my life in Trump's America, right? And I waltz into this restaurant. You walk through the door knowing this man has reclaimed sacred land and placed this sort of remembering, honoring, resurging, reclaiming, refreshing Indigenous stake in the world. And you walk in the door and there's this sign on the wall that says you are on native land, right? And there's just this there's just this vibe, there's just this feeling of joy, of celebration, of reclamation. And so I'm going on about it because I want you to know it exists, but I also want to use it as a metaphor for what we're trying to do in this country and what is going to be needed in this country. And also, frankly, the lessons that white people in this country can learn from the tenacity, creativity, and survival mechanisms of oppressed groups in this country. So you sit down at the table and you get the menu. And on it says, "The indigenous perspective on history of America is to acknowledge the centuries of intense violence, forced assimilation, segregation, and cultural erasure that has happened to our cultures and communities. We reject the values that have been upheld by settler colonialism, such as the wanton destruction of the environment, including mining, logging, and monoculture agriculture, all of which contribute to the enrichment of a select few, while our beautiful indigenous landscapes and the people who have traditionally lived on them are continually being abused. The goal of this restaurant is to showcase modern indigenous foods. This means that we prioritize purchasing from indigenous producers first and build our seasonal menus to reflect region, culture, and indigenous food identities. Our menu reflects the work of our nonprofit North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. We have cut out colonial ingredients such as beef, pork, chicken, dairy, wheat, flour, and cane sugar, instead highlighting true agricultural products of North America, such as corns, beans, squash, wild game, birds, fish, and native plants. This approach offers a different story of American cooking than the Eurocentric one that is traditionally touted, instead celebrating the amazing indigenous diversity of Turtle Island. Turtle Island there, of course, referring to the indigenous name for the North American continent. Okay. So anyway, I'm sitting there crying into my wild rice reading this because this is not just a menu. It is a manifesto of how to transform the deepest wound into the most powerful medicine. They are not just fighting the occupation with weapons. They are fighting it with food, the most basic act of care, of culture, of survival. And I have never had a restaurant meal sit so happily in my gut either. Like if I eat, actually consume a whole meal in a restaurant, which I don't often do because I don't like to feel bad. But when I do, I usually want to sleep it off, right? Like this groggy, bloated experience. Just me. And I don't feel like that after eating this meal, right? I felt nourished and loved on, truly, by the food, by the people who prepared it, and by the land that had produced it. I'm honestly telling you, it was the tastiest and still kindest meal I have ever consumed. So I just want to contrast. So the contrast here just could not be starker. In the same week that I get a peek at how Indigenous peoples are teaching us how to heal through acknowledgement and transformation, we've got Jillian Michaels on CNN explaining that we should not focus so much on the wound. This is the same woman who built her career on the idea of transformation. Transformation requires facing hard truths about yourself, that you can't heal what you won't acknowledge, right? That change requires going through discomfort, not around it. But when it comes to America's wounds, suddenly she and the community she represents want to skip straight to moving on. No facing the hard truth, no sitting with discomfort, no journey through the darkness that healing requires. All that remains is this dismissive, judgmental, punishing tone, right? The drill sergeant remains, and any insight into transformation and what it requires is quite absent. This is the colonial ingredient, y'all, in our national consciousness, this desperate need to not feel the wound, to not sit with the 400-year-old trauma, to not grieve what was done and what continues to be done. They want the Smithsonian to stop focusing on how bad slavery was. They want healing without acknowledgement of what needs to be healed. Now listen, I am the first person to acknowledge that early work in DEI. I was there, I was a part of it. The work from folks like Robin DiAngelo or Tim Wise or Peggy McIntosh, right, centers blame and finger pointing and even shame rather than what is truly needed, which is collective healing and systemic reform. The early work in this movement caused harm and divisiveness and defensiveness. We've come a long way learning how to have this conversation and keep everybody in the room at the same time when the stuff is so hard. But friends, the conversation needs to be had. But this dug-in, national, powerful, destructive response to the conversation is disproportionate and reeks of thou doth protest too much, right? Perhaps there are racist ideas persisting inside of us, and so many of us want to squish it or turn away from it rather than face the pain and grief associated with knowing and feeling it. Hell, I'll even stipulate that experiences between different oppressed groups across lines of difference can even enforce or inform stereotypes of the other, right? Fostering a contest to not end up on the bottom. In that scenario, punching down is almost logical. I get it. The net of all of this, though, is that we are at a potent impact point where the open question of whether or not we end up truly healing these wounds as a country is very much on the table. But the good news, of course, I'm always going to give you some good news when we look at this and find it buried in all of this intensity. But the good news is that what's happening in the sky that makes this moment so ripe for healing through our wounds, as Sean Sherman and his team at Owamni are teaching us to do. Let me introduce you then to Chiron. He is currently at 21 degrees of Aries. In mythology, Chiron was the wounded healer, a centaur shot by a poisoned arrow who couldn't die and couldn't heal, but he turned his grief and his suffering into a force that could heal others. So he became the greatest teacher of medicine in the ancient world. His wound becomes his wisdom. In astrology, Chiron shows us where we are wounded and where we have the opportunity in our lifetimes to become healers because of, not despite, that wound. The United States natal Chiron. So in the chart that was built about the United States moment of its founding, of its birth, July 4th, 1776 at 5:10 p.m., right? In that chart of the sky at that moment, we see Chiron in the 4th house of the United States, right? The house of foundation, of roots, of heritage, of identity, of culture. And it had, and the United States, can't make this up, had its Chiron return, meaning the moment your wounds rise up and demand healing because Chiron has returned to the same spot he was when you were born. So you haven't dealt with it, it's going to deal with you kind of moment. That Chiron return was, I swear to God, in February of this year, if you can believe that. I'm sure that you do. February 18th, to be exact, which was the day, by the way, that the president signed an executive order expanding presidential authority over federal agencies, including a new interpretation of the law for the executive branch. Can't make it up. So this week, we had 2 major Chiron aspects that explain a fair amount of what we're experiencing. On August 19th, this last week, the sun, who is in Leo, it's Leo season, right? Or it was, made a trine. A 120-degree angle that is an unbroken flow of supportive energy to Chiron. It's a little triangle in the sky. It's not a 90-degree angle. It's a little bit more. So the sun illuminates. This aspect, meaning the sun in this trine, and this unbroken flow of energy for Chiron, the wounded healer, says, look at your wounds with dignity. See how they've made you wise. And while it did that, while it created this trine with Chiron in the current sky, it was shining on the US natal chart too. It was shining on, was in the same spot as this little asteroid in America's birth chart called Hygeia, who represents healing and healers. So the sky was opening up all of us in America to the notion of healing in our personal lives and in the trajectory of the collective. If this hit your chart at all, like where your planets were, like if this had any impact on where your planets were, if the sun or Chiron were interacting with anything that's really significant for you, you may have noticed some kind of small moment, some small intervention, right? Some small invitation for healing. That's what I had walking into Sean Sherman's restaurant. This idea of healing, of resurgence, of reclamation pokes into your head, like comes right into your life last week. Anything? You got anything? If you don't, it may be that it didn't interact very directly with your chart, but many of us had an experience, a moment at least like that sometime last week, right? So anyway, the 19th is the day that Trump railed on the Smithsonian. And this is why it hit most of us like a lead balloon. He's officially swimming against that cosmic current of at least a temporary opening to healing, right? Sort of post this Chiron return, everybody's like, wait, we can heal this, right? So then on August 22nd, Venus in Leo makes a square, a tense, challenging aspect. So when you're in a square, you're kind of like there's a tension that if it hasn't been to the surface, now it's going to be in the surface, right? So it's a tension aspect between Venus, while she's in the skyline of Leo. So she wants beauty. She wants to be adored. She wants the glamorous victory. Trump has Leo rising to help you understand the shadow aspect of that sign, right? Like it's all about me. Do you know any Leo's main character energy, right? Which can go either way, of course. I have a child who, if I do say so myself, is a main character that everybody who meets her can get behind because she's full of love and generosity and humor. She's a Hufflepuff, right? So what does everybody need to be happy here? I want to know, right? Because I want to live a happy life, which involves making everyone around me as happy as possible. But the shadow of that, Leo, is, hey, everybody look at me and be happy because I am great. Do you see the difference? And you see how like it's a double-edged sword, like the same thing that can be your shadow can also be your light. This is true about all things and all people. So Venus wanting that adoration, Venus is about beauty, about value, about resources, right? So Venus wanting that adoration and happiness and glory in this case without the generosity sits at a 90-degree angle with Chiron. And Chiron's like, yeah, no, you got to heal first. First, you got to acknowledge what's broken. Glory comes after wisdom, not before. So there's a reminder of the fact that, yeah, greatness can come, but not like this. This is the day they raid John Bolton's home. This is the day that the wound enlarges significantly. I heard a few different people say this is the day they jumped the shark, right? That the day the TV series was like, oh, come on, that's not real, right? When some new kid is adopted by the family after 7 seasons, right? Like, it's just like, okay, we could carry on with this, I guess, but it sort of has jumped believability at this point. Stretches the imagination more than is comfortable. So Trump is reaching for glory. And what he's causing is the greatest violation of the security and sanctity of the American system of law and order in the country, right? The president is officially punishing dissent amongst elites. That's bad for the rest of us. We officially have the president of the United States criminalizing even his powerful enemies with the full force of the law in a city ensconced with masked armed men and military hardware who are targeting literally anyone, like a bunch of stormtroopers for, I don't know, stepping on a crack. Right, for having an open container or throwing a sandwich, for not using a blinker. The wound has become centralized, denying Venus her due. But y'all, the cosmic weather is asking, can you find the medicine in the wound? Can you transform your trauma into teaching? Can you nourish the people who are now living on this sacred stolen ground? Or will the wound, like Chiron's, just never ever heal? Or you can be like Jillian Michaels, who can scream at people to face their eating habits, but can't face America's original wound, who wants to claim demonization doesn't heal, which is true, while refusing to acknowledge what actually happened. The irony is staggering. She's right about the demonization part, but neither does denial heal, right? Neither does minimization. Neither does there were more good guys than bad guys. 2% of Americans owned slaves, you say, Jillian. I'm not even sure that's accurate, but say for a moment that it is. As if white people all over the country weren't benefiting from slavery Well, first you got economic benefits. You got poor people hiring themselves out as overseers, as slave catchers, as patrollers. Second, you've got social and psychological benefits. You got the racial caste system that places even the poorest white people above all Black people in a social hierarchy. Or you got, third, the political benefits. You got the Three-Fifths Compromise, which gave the South disproportionate representation based on enslaved populations, benefiting all white Southerners through outsized representation. Or you've got opportunity benefits. You've got the existence of slavery, making it so that poor whites weren't at the absolute bottom of the labor system, similar to today's structure where the poorest Americans are still above in the labor market, the migrant workers who tend to our agriculture. Or finally, you've got culture or ideological benefits, wherein the institution created a shared racial identity and solidarity among whites across class lines so that poor whites could feel like they had more in common with wealthy planters than with enslaved people who shared their economic struggle. Does that sound familiar? Does that help our understanding of why a whole bunch of immigrant communities and working class white communities and even some members of the Black community, the white rural poor communities, would now turn collectively on migrant workers, imagining themselves to be in the same league with the tech bros? Is that possible? Do you have a better understanding of that now? Venus and Leo, where Chiron is exactly this tension. Venus and Leo wants the glory, wants to be the good guy, wants to be with the benefited people, wants the beautiful story, wants the perfect Instagram, right? But Chiron says, no, first you got to acknowledge the wound. First you got to feel it fully. Then you can transform it. There are no shortcuts to healing. So this square with Venus is illuminating our avoidance of the wound, you see? But here's where it gets even more powerful. Chiron isn't operating alone. He is working with what the brilliant astrologer and teacher and seer Austin Coppock calls the great flying wedge of chaos. I've been telling you for months about this configuration that we're living through. It's unprecedented, right? So, which is why everything in our lives is unprecedented. Saturn and Neptune at 0, 1 degree of Aries, Uranus at 1 degree of Gemini, Pluto at 1 degree of Aquarius. These guys all move neighborhoods. They are all in 0 or 1 of their skyland houses. But here's what I haven't said clearly enough. It's not just that they're in this funky wedge, it's that the angles of that wedge are unprecedented in their support of us. So picture an actual flying wedge like geese in formation or a spearhead cutting through resistance. Two planets at the apex of the tip of that spear, and Saturn, Mr. Make Things Real, and Neptune, Mr. Dreams and Lies, with flowing supportive aspects backed to, think of the geese, right? So the front of the geese is Saturn and Neptune. So you got reality and dreams flowing back behind them to these other corners where you've got Uranus, Mr. Revolution on one side, and Pluto, Mr. Transformation on the other. So while those two trine each other in an unbroken flow of revolutionary transformation, they are pointing towards this place where reality and imagination meet. And then you got Venus now this week, Mrs. Love and Beauty and Glory, who is speaking deeply and transformatively with Chiron, Mr. Healing. And he's in this trine with, he's like fully engaged with this flying wedge. He's got an important angle with one of the planets in that flying wedge, right? So those three are discussing the United States and its original wounds. Love is arguing with healing and is talking to transformation. So these planets are talking to each other of this about the state of things now. The state of the country built on the unhealed wounds of the Indigenous people who were already here when it started. Built on the enslaved Africans who were imported to combine that wound with those of the Indigenous people who were being moved off the land that the Africans would then work for agricultural output. And those wounds, that Plutonian foundational trauma, is connected to the planets of transformation, consequences, and lies. Y'all, the thing is coming to a head. That flying wedge is going to climax. That is all. Rail Street. That's all. And while all this builds towards something we can't quite see, remember September, the month we enter on Monday, and Virgo season, the season we entered just this past Friday, brings us this year 2 eclipses in the month of September. So coming up this month, we have 2 very intense eclipses, one lunar and one solar. And those eclipses will accelerate whatever we're becoming. The cosmic weather is intensifying. The question is whether we will use it for healing or harm. The opportunity for change and a reckoning is rising beautifully, harshly, and beautifully. The cosmos is offering us a supported path for chaos to become transformation, not inevitable war, but supported evolution through this chaos. The question is, what kind of healers will we become as we fly through this on the back of this wedge? What kind of revolution? A kinetic confrontation is not entirely indicated by this formation, but a reckoning sure as hell is. And oppressed peoples all over the country are modeling the way through. There's a pattern where the wounded become the healers. It's happened before under similar cosmic weather. The last time Chiron was in Aries, the skyland of action and change and doing, was 1968 to 1977. What's remarkable about this period is how many different wounded populations simultaneously expressed a healing path that wasn't through revenge, as we see our government trying now, but through transforming their specific wounds into specific medicine for their communities. The American Indian movement, for example, was founded in 1968, just as Chiron enters Aries. It arises from centuries of genocide and cultural erasure. Their wound was the systematic destruction of Indigenous ways of life. Their medicine during this period, reclaiming sacred sites like Wounded Knee in 1973, not to wage war, but to occupy and prey on land where their ancestors were massacred. They transferred a site of trauma into a site of spiritual reclamation. They began teaching their languages again, performing ceremonies that had been illegal, showing that cultural survival itself was resistance. The Black Panthers respond to the wound of police brutality and systemic poverty, creating their breakfast program in 1969. The free breakfast program, providing free, nutritious meals to hungry school children to help them focus in school. Initiated in Oakland, California, the program quickly expands to 36 cities by 1971, serving an estimated 20,000 children daily at its peak. This was not random charity. It was a direct response to their specific wound. Black children were going to school hungry because of systemic economic racism, so the Panthers fed them. They said the wound is that America starves Black children. The medicine is that we will feed Black children ourselves. They transformed the wound of neglect into community care. Vietnam veterans come home wounded in body and spirit from a war they increasingly understood as unjust. Their wound was both physical and moral. They had been used as instruments of empire. Their medicine? They threw their medals back at the Capitol in 1971. They used their wounded bodies as testimony against war itself. Veterans in wheelchairs become the powerful anti-war voices because their wounds gave them a moral authority that others did not have. What connects all these movements under Chiron in the Aries skyland is this. Each group took their specific wound and transformed it into the exact medicine their community needed. Indigenous peoples did not try to become Black Panthers. Veterans did not try to recreate the American Indian movement. Each wound creates its own unique medicine. But here's what people like Jillian Michaels do not understand. None of these groups minimized their wounds. The Black Panthers didn't say, let's not focus too much on how bad racism is. They said, racism is starving our children, so we will feed them. They went through the pain to find the medicine. The Indigenous peoples at Wounded Knee didn't say, let's move on from the massacre. They said, this is where our people were killed, and we will transform it through ceremony. Each wound, fully acknowledged, becomes instruction for the healing. That's Chiron in the skyland of Aries. The wounded warrior becomes the wounded healer, but only by facing the wound completely. Go back further and consider that flying wedge of chaos. One of the key elements, Pluto, was in Aquarius during the American Revolution. It wasn't just about overthrowing British rule. The colonized people in the United States, such as they were, became the model for democracy worldwide. The wound of occupation became the medicine of independence, right? The dream of which, the idealized, romanticized dream of which, would invite nations out of monarchies and autocracies across the globe for centuries. It got complicated later. I'm just making a point about democracy and the birth of it, right? And the rise of consciousness about the dangers and evils of autocracy. When Neptune was in the Aries skyland, as it is now, during the Civil War, Enslaved people didn't just become free, they built the churches, the schools, the mutual aid societies that still anchor communities today. The wounds of slavery became the medicine of collective care. When Uranus entered Gemini, as it has today, Americans finally joined the World War, right? They hadn't joined. The people of the world didn't just fight for freedom, they created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The wound of empire became the medicine of human dignity. This is what it says in that declaration. Quote, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. And the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law, whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations. I mean, has anybody read that recently? What's different now, though, is we have all these placements happening simultaneously for the first time in recorded history, right? Telling us that the lessons from these past experiences where these planets were where they are now can be, yes, they absolutely can combine into kinetic war, sure. But the aspects are more, the angles are more supportive than that. There is a way through this that is not kinetic. I mean, if you think about it, the people who would be fighting these ridiculous stormtroopers are not currently that armed. I mean, sure, many of us are, but lots of us are not. We would be the idiots holding the gun in the movie that, like, the guy pops the gun out of your hand and you're like, oh no, now I'm being held up by my own gun, right? Like, it's absurd to imagine. I mean, I guess we'd figure it out. People have, right? I mean, I suppose the American Revolution was fought by farmers, but we have got to be open to the possibility that this is not going to end in a kinetic way. This is going to end through the darkness, by facing through this, like, wounded healer motif, right? The wounded healer pattern is not just possible, it has unprecedented support right now. And look who's teaching us how to heal that way. Indigenous peoples who survived literal genocide are showing us how to eat. Black communities who survived slavery are showing us how to organize. Immigrants who survived deportation are showing us how to persist and thrive and live in hope in spite of danger at every turn. The most wounded parts of America are the edifying wisdom that will heal us in this country if we let it. Which brings me back to Omni, where I would like to be every night for the rest of my life. And why it made me cry into my handcrafted Soto Blanco hibiscus shrub cocktail. Sean Sherman did not just open a restaurant. He brought back sacred Dakota land that was stolen, developed, covered in concrete and colonial architecture. Instead of trying to tear down what colonizers built, he did something more radical. He removed colonial ingredients from his menu. So no beef, no pork, no chicken, no dairy, no wheat, no flour, no cane sugar. These are not just foods. They are symbols of colonization, of forcing European agriculture onto American soil, of enslaving stolen peoples to cultivate crops that did not belong here, are exploiting enslaved labor farther south in the Caribbean and Central America, destroying indigenous food systems to create dependency. Instead, the menu features what was always there: corn, beans, squash, rice, game, fish, native plants, foods that know this land, that grew up from this soil thousands of years before colonization. Here's the metaphor that kind of broke me open sitting there. What if healing America means removing the colonial ingredients from our democracy? What if we were to undo piece by harmful piece the aspects of our society and our government that harms, that separates, that judges unfairly, that punishes difference, that punishes differently depending on who you are? But if we remove the beef, or the aggressive, dominating, extractive approach to power, or if we remove the wheat flour, the homogenizing force that makes everything the same, or if we remove the cane sugar, the sweet lies that make bitter pills easier to swallow, that cane sugar especially, man, it's what Jillian Michaels is peddling when she says there were more good guys than bad guys. It's the sweetener that makes the poison go down easier. It's the denial dressed up as thoughtful, conscious balance. It's the both sides that prevents us from ever actually healing because we won't look at what happened. At Owamni, they don't use cane sugar. They use maple syrup, honey, sweeteners that come from the land that don't require slavery to harvest. They're not trying to make colonization taste better. They're removing it entirely and finding that what remains is actually more nourishing, is actually much, much less harmful to the body. What will be left? What indigenous ingredients of democracy have been here all along, waiting under the concrete? I'm sure you're aware of the Iroquois Confederacy's influence on our Constitution, right? The concept of 7 generations thinking, the understanding that land does not have to belong to us. We belong to the land. The practice of council circles where every voice matters. The wisdom that a leader's job is to serve, not to dominate. Right? These are the trends that we can pull back from the past and make a part of our future. At Owamni, people are traveling from around the world to taste food that was always here. They're finding it more nourishing, more complex, more satisfying than anything colonial ingredients could create. Sherman isn't fighting colonization with violence. He's fighting it with bison and duck, with maple roasted squash, with remembering. The sacred land remembers what it was before the wound, and it's teaching us that healing doesn't mean going backwards. It means removing what was never supposed to happen here and discovering what was waiting underneath. So how do we work with this weather? How do we become healers instead of the next cycle of wounded warriors, or worse yet, the next generation of people with more power than the next guy who is punching down and inflicting harm? See them, pull them up beside you, for heaven's sakes. So how do we understand this? First, we understand that we're being asked to transform at the deepest level. This is not about political strategy or resistance tactics right now. I'm saying this is about removing colonial ingredients from our own consciousness, our own responses, our own dreams of what comes next. Second, we also have to recognize that the cosmos is offering unprecedented support for the transformation, but the transformation requires what Jillian Michaels apparently only applies to weight loss, something she believes can only occur with, quote, tough love, facing the hard truths about yourself. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge, right? She knows that. You can't transform what you pretend didn't happen. She also knows that. The Trump administration wants museums to stop focusing on how bad slavery was. Jillian wants us to remember there were more good guys than bad guys. This is the colonial sugarcoating that prevents the healing. The cosmos is saying, remove that ingredient, face the wound, feel it fully. My sister says, eat the pain, then transform it, right? The great flying wedge is not just creating chaos, it is creating unsupported evolution through chaos. It is moving through space and time and dragging us with it. Every wound you transform into wisdom right now has cosmic amplification. Third, we got to find healing where it's happening already and feed it with our presence, with our resources, with our stories. The wounded healers are already among us. They are not waiting for permission. They're feeding people. They're teaching truth. They are buying back sacred land. They are remembering what was always here. Here's what I'm seeing. The occupation of DC is the wound getting worse before it heals. The pre-dawn raids, the tanks, the threats to expand to other cities, this is the infection beginning to come to a head. It is a terrible and terrifying and also temporary phenomenon. Allow it to move you. Allow it to make you move. Allow it to change your behavior. But while that wound festers in the capital, healing is happening everywhere else. In Minneapolis, Indigenous chefs are feeding people. In communities across America, mutual aid networks are strengthening. In living rooms and churches and community centers, people are removing colonial ingredients from their own imaginations and discovering what was always possible. The sacred land does remember. The planets do remember, and they are teaching us, y'all. They are teaching anyone willing to listen that wounds can become medicine, that the deepest trauma can become the most powerful teaching, that nourishing others is the highest form of resistance. If we were to meet each other as real equals, share our medicine, look at the wound together, understand our role in holding it and perpetuating it and avoiding looking at it, we could be together building this new America. Sherman Alexie, the Spokane Coeur d'Alene writer, brings the medicine of the unknown to the table. He says, the world, even the smallest parts of it, is filled with things you do not know. That is what Owamni is teaching us. There's a whole world of nourishment we don't know because we've been eating colonial ingredients, inhaling them for so long, right? There's a way your body can feel after a meal that we have never gotten to know or appreciate. There's a whole democracy we haven't tasted because we've been force-fed the same bitter dishes of domination and extraction of a democracy built on wounds. But the recipes were always here. The sacred knowledge had always been surviving. The land had always been remembering. The people closest to it have long known, right? As we close today, I want to offer 3 things for working with this Chiron medicine that is around and inside of us today. First, an action. Find your Owamni. Where in your area is healing already happening? It might be a restaurant using traditional foodways. Check into the Indigenous food movement in your town. Somewhere near you, there is an Indigenous chef making local, pre-colonial ingredients sing. Or maybe there's a community garden growing Indigenous plants. Or maybe there's a situation where you're with your yard where you might leverage Indigenous wisdom to stop throwing chemicals at a lawn that spites you every time you turn around. Or maybe there's a mutual aid network feeding people without asking for documentation. Go there. Don't just donate. Go be there. Listen to the stories. Let yourself be nourished by spaces where wounds have already become medicine. Remember, Venus in Leo wants glory, but Chiron says healing comes first. Find where healing is happening and feed it with your presence to build and maintain that space. Second, I want to offer you a practice. This week, identify one colonial ingredient in your response to our current crisis. Maybe it's the beef of aggression or the urge to meet force with force. Maybe it's the wheat flour of homogenization, the need for everyone to resist the same way. Or maybe it's the cane sugar of minimization, the Jillian Michaels impulse to say it wasn't that bad, or let's focus on the positive when confronted with real harm. Notice how often you want to sugarcoat America's wounds. Notice the impulse to say, but they were good people too, when someone brings up slavery or genocide or the civil rights movement or even police brutality. Hell, the original both sides moment of our era was when this president in 1.0 responded to a neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville with this same cane sugar. There are good people on both sides, he said. That's colonial sugar right there. Remove it. Taste what's actually there beneath it. It might be bitter, but bitter medicine is still medicine, and it's more honest than sweet poison. It's better for you than sweet poison. What can you release that is just an old colonial habit? Reflect on this, write on this, consider this. Finally, I want to give you some inspiration. Joy Harjo, the Native American Poet Laureate of the United States. I'm going to sneak 2 offerings, one excerpt from her poem, Remember, and one from her poem, Eagle Poem. I've read a little bit of Remember before, but it may be my favorite poem, so you'll just have to tolerate it. And Remember, she says, remember the wind, remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember, you are all people, and all people are. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember, the dance language is, that life is. Remember. And from Eagle Poem, she says, to pray, you open your whole self to the sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you, and know there is more that you can't see, that you can't hear, that you can't know, except in moments steadily growing and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion, like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky and wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. September's eclipses are going to accelerate everything, y'all. This thing is heating up. And Virgo season, meaning the season where the sun is in the Virgo skyland, is upon us. I say this as a proud Virgo who is about to have her life unraveled a little bit. Eclipses are big ends and big beginnings, right? Things begin and things end during eclipses. And when they fall on important parts of your chart lights up and like things begin and end in your life. Especially if the moon and sun are hitting important spots in your chart. And for me, there's a lot going on in September. For all of us, though, for absolutely all of us, for this country, for sure, there's a lot going on in September. So those two eclipses will occur and great change will occur. We can handle that, though. We were built for this. Plant your seeds now of who you're becoming, right? The cosmos is offering unprecedented support. I know I keep saying that, but it's true. This great flying wedge of chaos, connecting with all these things, Chiron, Venus, one by one, right? Like that's never happened before. It's like lots of bits of it have, but not the whole thing, right? So it is organized in angles of support, chaotic support. So we've got it. We've got the support for transformation for us and for our country. Use it. The Great Flying Wedge is cutting through illusions, revealing that the emperor has no clothes, that the occupation has no future, that walls cannot stop water from finding its way. Saturn and Neptune at the tip of that wedge are dissolving old realities while building new ones. Uranus and Pluto in flowing support are ensuring revolution that serves transformation, not just destruction. And Chiron, right now, he's reminding us that our wounds are not weakness. They are wisdom. They are medicine. They're offering us to the world that is being born. The sacred land remembers what it was before colonization, and it is teaching us that we can remember too, that there is a democracy before this, not to go backwards, but to remove what was never meant to be here and to discover what was waiting underneath all along. If you would like to understand how these patterns are affecting your personal chart, how your own wounds are becoming medicine in this unprecedented time, I offer readings and coaching that can help you navigate your unique relationship with this cosmic weather. My email is in the episode description if you'd like to reach out. If you would also be so kind as to help me out by writing a review, so that the podcast will spread and more people will find it. You could also find me on Instagram, Direct Station Kate, on TikTok with the same name, Direct Station Kate, on YouTube with the name of the podcast, Politics in Retrograde. Although I don't totally know how to find even myself on YouTube. So you might have to use my name, Kate Carey. You might have to use the company's name, which is Direct Station. So anyway, find me in all the places and talk to me in all the places. Let's make this thing grow. Let's have a conversation about how this could be a healing time and not only a time of crisis. But until next time, y'all, remember, the occupation is temporary. The sacred land is eternal. And you are becoming the medicine this world needs, whether you know it yet or not. So until next time, be well, be conscious, and be kind. I'll see you soon.